The secure teletype machine at OKW headquarters in Berlin clattered to life in the early morning hours of September 8, 1943, transmitting an urgent message from Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's headquarters in Italy that would transform the Mediterranean theater's strategic situation and create immediate crisis requiring deployment of German forces that were desperately needed elsewhere. The Italian government, under Marshal Pietro Badoglio, had announced an armistice with the Allied powers effective immediately. Italian military forces throughout occupied Europe and the Mediterranean were laying down their arms or attempting to surrender to Allied forces, and the elaborate defensive positions that German and Italian forces had constructed across the Italian peninsula were now defended only by the substantially outnumbered German formations, while Italian units were in various states of dissolution, defection to the Allies, or armed resistance against their former German allies. General Alfred Jodl read the message with the sinking recognition that the scenario Wehrmacht planning had designated Operation Axis, the contingency plan for German occupation of Italy and disarmament of Italian forces in the event of Italian defection, would now have to be implemented under the worst possible circumstances, while Allied forces were already landing at Salerno and threatening to establish major beachhead on the Italian mainland, while German forces in Italy were dispersed across the peninsula in positions designed for cooperation with Italian allies who had now become enemies or neutrals. And while the broader strategic situation required Germany to defend against Allied invasion in the west, contain Soviet offensives in the east, and now somehow prevent complete collapse of the Italian front, with forces and resources that were already stretched beyond sustainable limits. The intelligence arriving at German headquarters throughout September 8th painted a picture of systematic collapse that exceeded even the pessimistic assumptions that had shaped contingency planning for Italian defection. Italian units were not conducting orderly surrender to German forces, as some scenarios had envisioned, but were instead fragmenting in multiple directions, some attempting to reach Allied lines to surrender there, others simply disbanding with soldiers returning to their homes, a few resisting German attempts to disarm them, and creating firefights that consumed German attention and forces at precisely the moment when those resources were needed for establishing defensive positions against Allied invasion forces. The Italian government's announcement had apparently caught many Italian field commanders by surprise, despite the negotiations that had been occurring for weeks, creating command chaos, where Italian officers lacked clear guidance about whether to cooperate with Germans, resist them, or attempt to reach accommodation with rapidly advancing Allied forces. Field Marshal Kesselring, who commanded German forces in the Mediterranean and who had been responsible for coordinating with Italian military leadership throughout the period since Mussolini's fall in July, had been preparing for possible Italian defection, but had hoped to maintain sufficient control over Italian forces to ensure orderly disarmament or continued cooperation. The reality was far worse than these hopes. The armistice announcement created immediate and comprehensive breakdown of Italian military structure, with units that had been defending positions alongside German forces suddenly becoming unreliable or actively hostile, with Italian-controlled transportation networks and supply facilities becoming unavailable or contested, and with the entire logistical and operational framework that German operations in Italy depended upon dissolving within hours. The operational implications were immediate and severe. German forces defending against the Allied landings at Salerno faced the prospect of Italian units in their rear areas either laying down arms or actively supporting Allied advances. The defensive positions in southern and central Italy that had been planned as delaying positions to be held by combined German-Italian forces now had to be held by German units alone or abandoned entirely as untenable. The tens of thousands of Italian soldiers throughout Italy represented potential threat to German rear areas, potential reinforcement for Allied forces if they could be organized and equipped, and immediate practical problem of how to disarm and secure hundreds of thousands of men who had suddenly transformed from allies to prisoners or enemies. Most strategically troubling was the situation in the Balkans and in occupied territories where Italian forces had provided garrison and occupation troops that freed German forces for combat operations elsewhere. The Italian units in Greece, Yugoslavia, Albania, and the Aegean Islands were surrendering to Allied forces, joining partisan formations, or attempting to maintain neutrality in ways that created power vacuums and operational challenges across vast territories. German forces would have to be diverted to occupy territories previously held by Italians to secure strategic positions before Allied or partisan forces could seize them, and to prevent the kind of complete operational chaos in the Balkans that might allow major Allied operations in that theatre. General Siegfried Westphal, Kesselring's chief of staff, compiled assessments throughout September 8th to 9th that documented the scope of the collapse with professional precision that made the catastrophe's dimensions undeniable. In southern Italy, entire Italian divisions had ceased to exist as military formations. In central Italy, some Italian units were attempting to maintain defensive positions, but were unwilling to engage in combat and were surrendering at first contact with Allied forces. In northern Italy, German forces were implementing Operation Axis with varying success. Some Italian units surrendered their weapons peacefully, others resisted and had to be overcome by force. Many simply dissolved, with soldiers disappearing before German forces could reach them. The comparison to previous German experiences with Allied forces collapsing was sobering. Romanian and Hungarian forces had proven unreliable on the Eastern Front and had often broken under sustained Soviet pressure. But those collapses had been gradual and had occurred during combat operations where German forces could respond to deteriorating situations. The Italian collapse was instantaneous and comprehensive, occurring simultaneously across multiple theaters and creating operational situations that German forces could not possibly address adequately with available resources. It was as if an entire tier of Axis military power had simply evaporated overnight, leaving Germany to defend territories and positions that planning had assumed would be shared burden with Italian allies. General der Panzertruppen Fridolin von Senger und Ettelin, commanding German forces in southern Italy and directly facing the Allied Salerno landings, sent reports that mixed professional assessment of the military situation with barely concealed frustration about the Italian collapse's timing and scope. The Salerno beachhead was expanding despite German counterattacks. Allied naval gunfire was providing devastating support to forces ashore, and the defensive positions that might have contained the landing if adequately manned were now held only by stretched German forces, who could not simultaneously defend against Allied assault and deal with disintegrating Italian units in their rear areas. Von Senger estimated that without Italian collapse, German forces might have prevented the Salerno beachhead from expanding, or at minimum might have imposed such heavy casualties that Allied operations would have been significantly delayed. With Italian collapse, the best German forces could hope for was conducting fighting withdrawals that delayed Allied advance while preserving German combat power for defensive operations farther north. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been designated to command in northern Italy and who was responsible for implementing Operation Axis in that region, approached the situation with characteristic energy, but also with recognition that the task exceeded available German forces and that decisions about how many resources to commit to Italy had profound implications for Germany's overall strategic position. Rommel understood that committing substantial forces to occupying Italy and defending the peninsula would weaken German positions elsewhere. Divisions sent to Italy were divisions unavailable for defending against the coming Allied invasion of France, for containing Soviet offensives that were progressively pushing German forces back across Eastern Europe, or for maintaining occupation of territories throughout German-controlled Europe that required garrison forces to prevent partisan activity or Allied operations. The Rommel-Kesselring dynamic created tension in German strategic planning for Italy throughout the fall of 1943. Kesselring advocated fighting for every kilometre of Italian territory, establishing defensive lines that exploited Italy's mountainous terrain to impose maximum delays on Allied advances, and committing whatever forces were necessary to prevent rapid Allied progress northward. Rommel argued for a more economical approach, defending only north of Rome or even withdrawing to the Alps, minimizing forces committed to Italian theatre, and prioritizing preservation of German combat power for operations that would determine the war's outcome rather than for delaying actions in secondary theatres. Hitler's decision to side with Kesselring and to commit substantial forces to defending Italy reflected several considerations. The strategic value of denying Allied forces air bases in central and northern Italy from which they could bomb German industrial targets and Romanian oil fields argued for holding as much Italian territory as possible. The political and propaganda costs of appearing to abandon Italy completely argued for visible German commitment to defending what had been Axis territory. Perhaps most fundamentally, Hitler's preference for holding ground over trading space for preservation of forces aligned with Kesselring's approach rather than with Rommel's more flexible concepts. This decision meant that Germany would fight extended defensive campaign in Italy that would last until war's end, that would consume divisions desperately needed elsewhere, and that would accomplish little beyond delaying Allied advances that were going to occur eventually, regardless of how skillfully German forces fought. The Italian front became strategic dead end, German forces defending territory with no possibility of achieving decisive results. Allied forces advancing against competent resistance, but toward objectives that were not themselves decisive for winning the war. Both sides would commit substantial resources to a campaign whose outcome was predetermined and whose strategic significance was limited. The practical challenges of implementing Operation Axis and establishing German control over Italy revealed both Wehrmacht capabilities and the limitations imposed by resource constraints. German forces moved rapidly to occupy key positions, disarm Italian units, secure transportation networks and communication facilities, and establish military government in occupied Italian territories. The speed and efficiency with which these operations were executed demonstrated organizational competence and operational flexibility that characterized Wehrmacht at its best. But the scope of the task, occupying an entire country, disarming an army of hundreds of thousands, establishing control over vast territories while simultaneously defending against Allied invasion, exceeded what available German forces could accomplish completely. The result was that German control in Italy was thorough in some areas and minimal in others, creating patchwork of German-occupied zones, areas controlled by Italian partisan formations, regions where neither German nor partisan forces exercised effective authority, and territories where Allied advances were occurring faster than German forces could establish defensive positions. This fragmentation characterized Italian theatre throughout the remainder of the war, and contributed to the campaign's grinding, attritional character, where neither side achieved decisive operational results, but where fighting continued consuming resources and lives. The fate of Italian soldiers caught between former German allies, who now treated them as enemies or prisoners, and Allied forces who were potential liberators, but who were engaged in active combat operations, created humanitarian crisis that complicated military operations. Hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers were attempting to return home, to avoid capture by either German or Allied forces, or to join partisan formations. German forces attempting to disarm Italian units faced choices about whether to treat surrendering Italians as prisoners of war, requiring resources for internment and guard forces, or to simply release them and accept the risk that they might join partisan formations or provide intelligence to Allied forces. The decision to deport substantial numbers of Italian soldiers to Germany for forced labor created additional logistical burden on transportation networks that were needed for military operations, created political problems in Italy, where families of deported soldiers became hostile to German occupation, and demonstrated the intersection of military, political, and ideological considerations in how Nazi Germany approached occupation and control of former Allied territories. The brutality with which some Italian units that resisted German disarmament were treated, including massacres of Italian soldiers on Greek islands who refused to surrender, revealed that the transition from ally to enemy could be violent, and that German forces were willing to use extreme measures to establish control, even when such measures created additional resistance. The intelligence reaching OKW about partisan activity in Italy throughout late 1943 and into 1944 documented how Italian collapse had created insurgent movement that was more significant than might have emerged if Italy had remained allied to Germany, or if German occupation had been established through negotiated transition rather than through sudden hostile takeover following armistice announcement. Italian soldiers who might have continued fighting alongside German forces, or who might have accepted disarmament peacefully, instead joined partisan formations or provided support to resistance movements, creating security challenges in German rear areas that required commitment of forces to anti-partisan operations rather than to defending against Allied advances. The comparison between how German forces responded to Italian collapse versus how they responded to other Allied defections revealed both Wehrmacht capabilities and German strategic priorities. When Romania switched sides in August 1944, German forces fought to extract themselves from untenable positions and to establish new defensive lines. But they did not attempt large-scale occupation of Romanian territory or systematic disarmament of Romanian forces. When Hungary attempted to negotiate armistice in October 1944, German response was to overthrow the government and install puppet regime. But occupation was focused on maintaining control of strategic positions rather than comprehensive control of entire country. In Italy, German response was most comprehensive, attempting to occupy entire peninsula, disarm all Italian forces, and establish German military government, reflecting Italy's strategic position, the resources Germany was willing to commit to Mediterranean theatre, and perhaps Hitler's personal sense of betrayal by Mussolini's successors. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief military adjutant, compiled assessments of the strategic implications of Italian collapse that attempted to frame the disaster in ways that emphasized opportunities rather than focusing exclusively on challenges. Yes, Italian defection created immediate crises and required German forces to assume burdens previously shared with Italian allies. But it also eliminated unreliable ally whose failures had contributed to Axis setbacks in North Africa and whose political instability had created uncertainty about commitment to continued fighting. German forces defending Italy without Italian participation could at least be certain that defensive positions would not be compromised by Italian unreliability or defection, that planning could be based on actual German capabilities rather than on optimistic assumptions about Italian performance, and that resources committed to propping up failing Italian war effort could be redirected to German operations. This attempt to identify silver linings in the Italian collapse reflected Keitel's role as Hitler's loyal subordinate who was expected to frame situations in ways that reinforced rather than challenged the Führer's judgments. But it also revealed genuine recognition that Italy's military contribution to Axis war effort had been more burden than asset in many theatres. The question was whether the costs of occupying Italy and defending the peninsula with purely German forces would exceed the costs that had been incurred by maintaining alliance with progressively less capable and reliable Italian military forces. The answer, visible by late 1944, was that German forces defending Italy were accomplishing the limited objective of delaying Allied advances and preventing Allied air bases from being established in northern Italy, but at costs that exceeded the strategic value of these achievements. The divisions tied down in Italian theatre were divisions unavailable for defending against D-Day invasion in France, for containing Soviet offensives that were destroying Army Group Center, or for defending the Reich's borders against attacks from multiple directions. The Italian front had become one of several theatres where Germany was committing resources to delaying inevitable defeat rather than to achieving results that might alter war's trajectory. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, who eventually commanded German forces in Italy and who oversaw the defensive campaigns through the Gothic Line and winter positions, understood that he was fighting battles that could be won tactically, but that could not achieve strategic results that would affect war's outcome. His forces demonstrated tactical competence in defending mountainous terrain, made Allies pay heavily for territorial gains, and conducted fighting withdrawals that preserved German combat power while imposing delays on Allied advances. But these achievements occurred within framework where strategic outcome was predetermined. German forces would progressively retreat northward, Allied forces would progressively advance, and the campaign would terminate either when German forces in Italy surrendered or when overall German collapse made continued Italian resistance pointless. The broader implications of Italian collapse extended beyond the Mediterranean theatre to affect German strategic position globally. The defection of major ally demonstrated that Axis cohesion was fragile, that prolonged warfare was eroding commitment of partners who had entered war with expectations of quick victory, and who were unwilling to sustain the costs of total war against enemies with greater resources. This had implications for Germany's relationships with remaining allies, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Finland, all of whom were watching Italian example and calculating their own interests in ways that increasingly diverged from German preferences. The Italian collapse thus accelerated the unraveling of Axis alliance system and contributed to a series of defections in 1944 that left Germany fighting alone against coalition that controlled overwhelming majority of global resources and population. When German generals learned that the Italian front had completely collapsed on September 8, 1943, they were learning that a strategic assumption underlying Mediterranean theatre planning had been invalidated, that German forces would have to shoulder burdens previously shared with Italian allies, and that the resources required to occupy Italy and defend against Allied invasion would consume divisions and material needed for other theatres where Germany's strategic situation was equally or more desperate. The Italian collapse was not unexpected. Contingency planning had occurred, and Operation Axis implementation demonstrated that Wehrmacht could respond rapidly to Allied defection. But the scope and comprehensiveness of the collapse exceeded planning assumptions. The timing coincided with Allied invasion, creating maximum operational challenges, and the strategic costs of responding to the crisis would contribute to Germany's progressive exhaustion across multiple fronts. The generals who absorbed the news understood they were witnessing another step in the gradual disintegration of Germany's strategic position. Another instance where resources and attention had to be diverted to address crisis that should have been shared burden with allies, but that had become German problem to solve with capabilities that were already inadequate for the challenges Germany faced.